I'm going to speak very, very briefly, show you a few slides, and set it up because these are the real experts here. And let me just go in and grab my slides. In the year 2000, I was approached when I first arrived here at Northeastern by the Cardinal Law and the Archdiocese of Greater Boston, and at the same time by the President of the Chamber of Commerce of Greater Boston, Paul Guzzi. And they were both concerned by the fact that they had looked at the data, and for 5 years, housing prices in Greater Boston have been rising at double-digit rates per year. To the Cardinal, we had as he put it, a moral obligation to assure that there would be affordable housing for everyone living in the city of Boston and in the Greater Boston region. And for the head of the chamber, Paul Guzzi saw having housing that would be affordable to the workforce was an absolute economic necessity if the Greater Boston area and the Commonwealth were to remain prosperous. And so you had the church and the chamber getting together and talking about a moral obligation and an economic necessity. We ended up writing something called the New Paradigm Report for the two of them, for the two organizations, in which we laid out what the problem was in Greater Boston, why prices had been skyrocketing, and what the implications would be, as well as probably what some of the solutions might be. Indeed, in the 40 years that I've been doing research, it is probably the report that I was proudest of all I've ever done. It led to annual housing report cards. We'll be turning out the 7th on October 28th at the Boston Foundation, thanks in large part to my co-professor Paul Grogan in Boston Foundation. It led to, in part, to the creation of the Commonwealth Housing Task Force, a group of people that include not only those who have a direct interest in housing developers, both profit and non-profit bankers, but all kinds of people who do have no direct interest, but understand that getting housing right in the Commonwealth is critical to the future success of the region. We ended up writing new legislation, Chapter 40R and 40S, which you may hear a little bit about today. If not, ask us about it in the question and answer session. And we've been working very hard to make sure that we have the right kinds of housing for the right kinds of people, and as Bonnie and Doug will tell you, in the right places. It is a major problem. But of course, over the last 2 years, we have seen a very different problem, a problem of prices falling in some parts of the city by more than 50, parts of the country by more than 50%, in places like Phoenix and in Las Vegas and Miami. Massive rise in foreclosures, people losing their homes. Not as bad here in Greater Boston, but nonetheless, we've suffered. So what I want to do very quickly, literally in only about 6 or 7 minutes, is go through 2 kinds of slides. The first to tell you, where are we now? Kind of a preview of what we're going to do on October 28th. If there's a member of the press here, these are all embargoed. You can't use them until October 28th. And then I want to talk a little bit about why affordability is still an issue and why it is such a serious issue. So let's just take a look at foreclosures, permits, housing prices, and rents. We don't have data on new housing starts right at the Greater Boston area, but if you look at the northeast quadrant of the United States, you can see what has happened to housing permits beginning in 2005 when they peaked at 40,000 in the northeast. Those are new homes being started that year, falling to 35,000. This is just in the second quarter, and I've outlined red lines so that I'm not, because you have a seasonality in this, I'm just looking at the second quarter. So we had 40,000 housing starts in the second quarter, April, May, June of 2005, down to about 35,000 in 2006 second quarter, to 32 to 19 to just 13,000 in the second quarter of this year, the quarter that ended in June. That is a dramatic decline. That is actually the lowest production level we've had in decades. If you look at housing permits just here in Greater Boston, you'll see when we were writing our original reports, we were getting 8,000 to 9,000, 8,000 to 10,000 units of housing, of new housing permitted each year. We needed about 15,000 units of housing, and because we didn't have 15,000, and we only had 10,000, there was tremendous demand pressure that wasn't being met by supply, and prices exploded. By 2003, however, we were starting to see some real improvement, and indeed in 2005 we came very close to hitting the goal we had set in 2000 in our new paradigm report of 15,000 new permits in that year. 2006, even before the recession begins, we're down to 12,000. We're down to 9,700, 9,800 in 2007. The official national recession does not begin until December of that year, and in fact, we do not feel recession until sometime in 2008. Nonetheless, we're down to only about 9,800 units. By 2008, we're down to about 6,500, and this year, our forecast is that we'll produce no more than 3,500 new units of housing, or at least permitted, not just produced, not even produced. That is a dramatic decline in production levels. If you look at median price of single-family homes and condominiums, you'll see that explosion in housing prices between 2000 and 2005. In 2000, the median price of a single-family home in Greater Boston was $260,000. 5 years later, it was $407,000. That's an extraordinary increase. Since then, housing prices stabilized in 2006 and 2007. They fell to about $358,000 in 2008. And for all of 2009, we're projecting that single-family housing prices will be around $327,000. Condo prices rose very much like single-family homes. Condos became very popular from 2000 to 2005. And indeed, their price did not fall at all, even once single-family prices began to fall. 2006, 2007, 2008, they were basically stable with a little over $300,000. And only in 2009 did we see any softening in that market at all. If you look, however, at monthly data, you'll see from January 2008, basically the beginning of the current recession, through June of 2009, this year, just a couple months ago, you'll see it peaking out in June of 2008 at about $392,000. You then see it declining very sharply through about March of this year. And as far as we can tell, March was the kind of bottom of the market. And the official data we're using here from Warren, the Warren Group, which follows these things each month, is there's actually been a pretty decent recovery, at least through June. We have no idea whether that will continue. We don't expect it to continue at that rate, certainly, but that in fact there does seem to be some light at the end of the tunnel, although tomorrow morning you're going to read in the Boston Globe and the Herald that we had a very, very bad economic month in September. The new numbers are out. We lost 9,600 jobs last month, if we believe that, after having lost almost no jobs in the last 4 months before that. And so we don't know whether in fact we're at the bottom, as I would hope we are, or whether in fact we're going to have continued weakness in the economy that could show up as weakness in this market. But if in fact the September job numbers were an aberration, and they may be, they're first estimates and they're based on a small sample, we may have seen the bottom of the market and we may see some recovery in the next months. As prices fell, those are the blue bars, it's not surprising that the permits fell along with them. Developers did not see a good reason to increase the supply of housing when prices are falling, and so you see a very neat relationship between housing prices and permitting with about a year lag. Foreclosures, of course, started occurring very sharply after 2005. We had a lot of people who had purchased homes, about 30%, using subprime mortgages for people who had greater credit risks. More and more people were coaxed into getting adjustable rate mortgages that were subprime. And as housing prices began to fall, more and more of these people found themselves underwater. That was, their homes were worth a lot less than their mortgage. Others found their mortgage rates adjusting to levels they could not afford, and you began to see a significant number of housing foreclosure petitions, meaning people who were at least 90 days late in paying their mortgage. And that peaked at about 16,000 in Greater Boston in 2007. Declined a little in 2008 because of a right to cure law that we had from Governor Patrick, which slowed down the foreclosure petition activity. And it was back up around 15,000 according to our estimates through the end of this year, estimated. If you look at petitions versus deeds, you see something quite different. A petition is not necessarily means somebody's going to lose their home. It means that the mortgage company is petitioned to get people to pay their mortgage or be threatened with the loss of their home. A foreclosure deed is when you lose your home. You'll see that we had this sharp decline. It's the black line are the petitions. Sharp decline, particularly in May and June of last year, when we had the cure. And then we saw the petitions start to rise again, and they've continued to rise right through July. On the other hand, the peak in actual foreclosure deeds came all the way back in May of 2008, more than a year and a half ago. And since that time, we've seen a decline in the number of deeds, which we think reflects both the fact that there are a lot of foreclosure petitions out there, and this is just clogged up in the system, but we also believe that there is the beginning of some real refinancing of some of these mortgages, making it possible for people to get better rates or extending their mortgages in ways they're able to hold on to their homes. And we hope that that trend will continue. What about affordability? Well, one of the ways that we look at affordability is we just ask, what is the ratio of the median selling price of a home in Greater Boston to the nominal median household income? So we're looking at the median priced home versus the median household income. This exploded between 2000 and 2005. That is, it was a ratio of about 4.72. That is, the median selling price was less than 5 times median household income. By 2005, only 5 years later, it was 6.5. It is a huge increase, meaning that housing had become more unaffordable. In 2006 and 2007, it stayed around a little above 6. In 2008, it was down to about 5.4 as housing prices were falling while incomes were stagnating. So in this sense, housing has become more affordable as a result of the prices coming down. We don't have numbers on 2009 yet. If you looked at effective apartment rents, however, just the opposite happened. During much of the early 2000s, when home prices are going through the roof, rents were stable or falling in Greater Boston. And then, after 2005, when home prices stabilized and began to fall, rents went through the roof. What's that all about? Well, as a matter of fact, they're very closely linked. Because if you think about it, in this period after 2005, well, think about the early period, 2000 to 2005, lots of people who would normally have stayed in rental housing were now getting into home ownership, in part because of subprime mortgages. They were no longer putting pressure on the rental market because they were in the home ownership market. And then, during the period of time when housing prices started to fall, foreclosures started to rise, lots of individuals who might have been ready to get into the housing market stayed on the sidelines, hoping prices would fall further. Rents rose because the demand for rental housing exploded. And that continued right through the third quarter of last year. We've seen a little bit of retrenchment in those rentals. But if you think about it, here is a housing crisis which affects those people who owned, particularly people who got into the market very late in the mid-2000s and now saw their home values going down just after they bought their home. Certainly a lot of pain there. But on average, people who rent homes in Greater Boston tend to be lower and moderate income families rather than wealthy families. They're the ones, in a sense, who bore the brunt of this housing cycle. That's something we should be concerned about. Indeed, when we looked at monthly gross rent, we found out that by 2007, Boston was tied with San Diego for having the second highest gross rent of the largest cities in the country, much higher than most of the others. Well, what does that mean in terms of annual effective rent as a percent of median renter household income? or to put more correctly, if you have the income of a median renter and you went out into the market today to try and rent a median rental price home or apartment, what percentage of your annual income would you have to spend? Believe it or not, you'd have to spend half your income. 30% is considered about the right percentage. We're up at about 50%, up from about 46. It's always been bad. It got a lot worse right through the recession. So, does this have any effect on the economy? Well, we've recently done a lot of research on this question, and we believe the answer is yes. What we did, very simply, is we took 347 metro areas in the country, essentially all of them, and we figured out their housing cost, and then we arrayed them all according to their housing cost, from the lowest cost housing in places like Arkansas and Alabama, but also Flint, Michigan, and other deindustrialized cities, to those cities with the highest cost of housing. And then what I did here in this particular graph is just look at the percentage difference from one decile to the next. So the lowest 10%, the next 10%. The second decile here, if you follow this chart, the mean housing cost is 7.6% higher than the mean for the first decile. The mean of the third is only 5% higher than the second. The mean of the fourth is only 4% higher than the third, and so forth. Until you get to the 10th decile, the most expensive housing, in places like San Francisco, Honolulu, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C. And that decile is off the charts. It's 31% higher than the 9th decile. It's 85% higher than the average housing cost in the country. So there is this group of about 35 metro areas, Boston being one of them, that are just way out of line with everybody else. And Boston is actually 51% above, their housing costs are 51% above the 9th decile mean. That's staggering. What does it mean? Well, just two more slides. If you look at the relationship between what we call net domestic migration, that is, not counting immigration. We have positive immigration from foreign countries into Greater Boston and into Massachusetts, Greater Boston. What you would find if you look at net domestic migration are people who lived here and left to another state versus those people who came from another state, as I did when I moved from Michigan in 1971 to Massachusetts, or from Detroit to Boston. And what's very interesting is you see, as you go from the least cost housing to more expensive housing, right through the 9th decile, there's actually a positive relationship between in-migration and housing costs. That is, the in-migration rate in the 9th decile was almost 6%. That is, they had in-migration equal to 6% of their population in 2000. That's a very significant amount of in-migration for a relatively more expensive place to live. And you'll see that positive relationship. We actually think that positive relation works in reverse. That is, because these places have attracted a lot of people, they've put some more pressure on the housing market and made that housing market a little bit more expensive. But once you hit that 10th decile, that top decile, the darn thing turns around dramatically. And you get actually net out-migration. And the higher your cost, the higher the net out-migration. So we had the next 15, the next 10, and the top 10. Boston was the 6th highest. That averaged a 7% out-migration rate, 6.7%. Boston was right there at 6%. So for most cities, not much relationship between out-migration and the cost of housing. If anything, it looks positive. But you get to be one of those high flyers, and it turns around and it begins to penalize you as young people and others begin to say, if I have a choice of taking a job in Raleigh, North Carolina, where housing prices are literally 55% of what they are here, or Boston, where am I going to go? And it turns out the same thing is true of employment. Positive relationship between employment growth in metro areas, right through the 9th decile. And then in the 10th decile, you'll see it turns and starts going negative. The more expensive you are, the slower your employment growth. And in fact, Boston had negative employment growth between 2000 and 2006, Greater Boston. And therefore, you get this kind of relationship. So, going back to the new paradigm report, it's a moral obligation. You saw what happened to affordability. Church, going back to the new paradigm report, it's an economic necessity. Chamber of Commerce. Those are the kinds of things that I worry about. We want to have prices that allow us to retain young people, bring them here. We've talked about the third Civil War in this class, attracting young people. This is the way we're going to have to do it. We're going to have to find out about how to get the right housing stock for the right people in the right places that will be consistent with maintaining our obligation for affordable housing and the economic necessity of keeping people in jobs in the Commonwealth in Greater Boston. So, now we're going to hear from Doug.